Okay, so I want to talk about how these Ancestry DNA tests are misleading. Okay, because I'm seeing a lot of people sort of misinterpreting these results or taking these results very literally or just approaching it from that sort of misleading way that these companies are presenting these so called ancestry results. Because, first of all, they present them as ethnicity results. That's already misleading from the start because they are not, maybe on some sense we can say there are ancestry tests, but they do not test ethnicity. Okay. Ethnicity is social. Okay. And you can't be genetically something social. So it's ethnicity, or let's just say tribal culture, because I just feel like ethnicity is just a pretentious word for tribal culture. Tribal culture is social, and genes are material. You can't genetically be something social. Okay, but they say this is your ethnicity, and people are walking around thinking that's their ethnicity. No, that was that was a tribal culture of your ancestors. That that can correlate, but not always. Okay. You see that a lot in this sort of dysphoria associated populations where it's like, I'm 80% English or I'm 80% British. No, you're not. Your some of your ancestors, your originators, were British, but what language do you speak? And what language did your parents speak? Because tribal culture is most was typically going to be contained in a language, a very specific language. That's a way to find sort of figure out your tribal culture and heritage. Like you have Yank heritage, you have Yank origins with some British origins or cultures. Okay, or I'm 32% Nigerian. No, what language do you speak? What language did your parents, grandparents, great grandparents, great great grandparents, great 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 grandparents speak? That's your tribal heritage. That's your cultural heritage. That's your culture. Okay. Um, it's misleading, and it's even more misleading because how they break it down into like percentages. Like if you get 25% British, that would typically indicate, of course, that could mean various admixture, but that would still sort of reflect on average, a British, a culturally British great a grandparent. Okay, but was your grandparent British? No. Another way you can see this is through Icelandic sort of associated identified populations. Someone with like deep Icelandic heritage. Okay, they'll take the test and they'll get something like 70% Scandinavian, um, Norwegian, let's say 7% Norwegian, and like 80% Norwegian, 15-20% Irish or something. So if you walk up to an average Icelander and be like, is your ethnicity Norwegian and Irish? They're going to be like, no. Their culture is Icelandic. Like that 20% Irish would indicate about a grandparent that was culturally so-called Irish, but they're not. Their grandparents were culturally Icelandic. Going back for generations, there would be um, Icelandic. They have Icelandic heritage. That's their tribal culture. That's their culture. Icelandic. Okay. So the results can be rather misleading. So, but yes, in a sense, they do. Their originators were, some of their originators were Irish and Scandinavian or Norwegian. And technically they're still Scandinavian, but you know what I mean. Like, but one saying that it's an ethnicity is misleading, and then putting it as percentages, it's just misleading as well. Okay. Ideally, there would be like a slider of some sort where it shows the different sort of time periods of where that would make sense. But they don't do that. Okay. And another thing, people, how these tests are sort of misleading is people are taking it very sort of literal. It's not literal. Um, Basically, you can't be genetically a country. You can't genetically be an ethnicity or a tribe or a culture. You can't genetically be a continent. All those things are sort of imaginary constructs. They're social constructs, and DNA is material. A continent, a country are just made up territorial boundaries. You can't genetically be a made up territorial boundary. But you can't even genetically be an ethnicity or a tribe. Those are social as well. They're basically memberships. Like, I don't even say like that person is so and so. That person has so and so membership, because that's what it is. It's just membership based. And some have more strict membership policies, basically. You can't genetically be any of it. None of it is literal. It's true, yes, in a sense, in like a theoretical sense, in a imaginary sense, in a even in a sort of informational sense, but it's not like cold hard facts. It's not literal. It's impossible. Okay. Basically, um, they are taking these genetic companies are taking genetic patterns that have a long historical presence in a place, and then labeling those genetic patterns that place. For example, take Ashkenazi Jew members, the average one, just because they're a fairly genetically homogenous population. Let's say their genetic pattern is, just to simplify it, A okay, and they go to a colony on Mars. Hundreds of years pass, so their genetic pattern becomes AAAAM. These genetic companies could label that genetic pattern, that whole genetic pattern, as Martian. And then if you get that genetic pattern, they'll give you a percentage of Martian. That's all they're doing. They're taking a distinct genetic pattern that has a historical presence in that place, and then labeling that genetic pattern as that with that place. So in a sense, they are Martian. They are, let's say they have a kid and they would get 25% or something Martian. That is true in a sense. It does have some sort of informational, theoretical sort of validity and value. Okay, but that's all that it is. From one angle, it's true, but no, they're not one literally Martian. Okay, too, and then it's just a correlation. Okay, um, and in the same sense, it's like, and that's what they're doing with all these other places. More so, it's fairly obvious in different situations. For example, someone's like, I'm 25% Nigerian. How so when Nigeria only existed since like what 1930, 1940, 1950? That's telling you how much of what no, 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 no. Uh, I I got Nigerian on test, and it's like I can't get Nigerian on test because Nigeria didn't exist when my originators lived there. They can't be Nigerian. Um, but they got a lot of samples from people who have a historical presence in Nigeria, then got that average genetic pattern, and then labeled that genetic pattern Nigerian. And since I have a genetic pattern similar to it, they gave me Nigerian. So no, they're not my. That doesn't. I can't be Nigerian. Can't have Nigerian ancestors, and yeah, even though it would indicate like that, I have like a grandparent who's like Nigerian, which I don't. They were born here in the U.S. and their parents spoke, U.S. Creole. Okay, and then there's like because people are saying, well, it's accurate, right? Yes, it's accurate. Wouldn't that person who came from the colony on Mars and was like got tested and said they're 25% Martian, that's accurate. They are Martian because that genetic pattern. That's just how we label things. But that's all that's happening. But it's only accurate in a sense. Okay, it can easily become very misleading and like convoluted. Okay, but then it's not even. But then it's even more misleading in a sense because it's like um not none of my or, well for Nigerian especially they were not Nigerian, but even well let's take someone like British, like there will be someone with like deep roots in the U.S. Okay, but then they have some British people. Okay, not even then it should be a lot. You could get British percentages, but it should be a lot less because you're just not your recent originators are not even genetically British. Not that anyone's literally genetically British, but you know what I'm saying. What I mean is take how you know how there can be different shades of a color. Let's say that there's different shades of red. Okay. Um, and let's say like your DNA is crimson and British is like let's say it's pink. Okay. So even though your genetic patterns are crimson, and then you have some speckles of pink in there, but your DNA is crimson, but they're comparing since they don't have crimson in their database, they're comparing it with just the closest color, or let's say like blue and cyan. So you have cyan, and then they have blue, and it's the British labeled DNA. Okay, because there's no uh, cyan in the database, they're going to label you the closest color. So even though you're a distinct genetic pattern, have these distinct genetic patterns, they're just going to label it blue. So it's saying British, 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 but you're not. I mean, Icelandic people are a better example of that. Okay, so they get let's say the same thing, right? They have cyan and pink. Let's do the opposite: cyan and pink. Okay, but they're not using cyan and pink in their database. They're using blue and red. Since cyan and pink, the closest they're just giving you the closest thing that they have to blue. I mean to cyan, which is blue. So they're saying blue, 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 Norwegian, Norwegian, but that's not true because they're genetically Icelandic if we were to label it. Okay, and it is distinct. If you like look at charts, like genetics distance from populations, Icelandic is way over here because they've been isolated and they form from like a bottleneck. They're pretty fairly distant from it's distinct. They're genetically distant from Norwegians and Scandinavians and Irish and that's and forth. But that's just the closest color, so they're giving you that color. Okay, that's all they're doing. Like, and they can do that. They could put cyan and pink in the database, and then you would get, 100% Icelandic, because that's distinct genetic patterns, and then we could label that the historical place where that genetic patterns were Iceland. But that wouldn't be interesting. They're just choosing not to do that. Instead, they take, so they scan it like, okay, cyan. What's the closest to cyan? Blue. Okay, Norwegian, 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 Norwegian. Scanning. Pink. What's the closest to pink? Red. Okay, then give them red. Boop, 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 boop. So Norwegian, Irish. Okay. Yes, in a sense, they do have originators from there. They would get that as well, but like, and realistically, it would be like something like a small percentage, like 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 at the most, and like 1% Irish, 2% Irish. Okay, but then people still think it's accurate because then you'll have like Irish associated populations. They're like, yeah, it's accurate. I got 100% Irish. That's what my originators have been since forever. It's like, one, a lot of those cases, you guys are just you're they're using your results as a reference panel. Like, they have these data sets, these databases of reference populations. So yes, they took your specific genetic pattern, labeled Irish, but you're within the reference population. They're comparing your DNA to your own DNA, which is why you're getting 100% that. But then that's still not accurate. It's accurate in a sense from one angle, but in a complete way, in a total way, in a sensible way, no, it isn't. Because no, that still isn't um, accurate. Okay, because you can't be 100% Irish. Like, there's this odd, like, flat, static approach to these populations and heritage and histories. Like, it doesn't make sense to say, oh, that person's Irish. That doesn't make sense. Which Irish? Technically, recent immigrants to Ireland are Irish. Um, like, there'll be people who'll be like, yeah, I have Irish heritage. Okay, do you have, what do they call it? Shelta? Like, the travelers, do you have that heritage as well? Well, if you're claiming to have Irish heritage, but you don't have that heritage, that's erasure. So there's multiple distinct populations that would fall under that sort of Ireland label. I think we should actually just move away from that. It's actually even weird to call people like, that person's Irish, that person's British. It's like sort of objectifying, and it's nonsensical. Okay, but in terms of genetics, like, so you got 100% Irish, but that's not true, because in the same sense, it's like there's been population waves um, there's been various population sort of inputs throughout Ireland's history. Okay, distinct populations, and you're admixed with that. So again, they're taking a genetic pattern, like, and I'm not saying that there is like a sense of a more, I mean, it's hard to say. Where do you pinpoint Irish people? When's the line? When do you stop? When do you begin? Because, um, because let's say it this way. So there is like that more uh, historically deep. I don't know how to say it. Irish population. Let's call them like I. Let's say it's like 8-letter sequence, and let's say eight, uh, 5 of the letters are I, representing what was it, like the Celtic people? But see, even they're admixed. Okay, let's just call that I. But then there was like Norman and like I think like first French, maybe it was French, but Vikings. There was different populations. Let's say some were the Vikings. V, and there was like different English input there because there was various times England sort of swooped in. So let's call that uh, E, right? So it's I, 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 V, E, and then there was other little inputs from there. They take that whole genetic pattern and then they label it Irish. So they're kind of masking that admixed genetic pattern, which is not totally misleading. It's just misleading in the sense that they don't, how they frame it as percentages and as ethnicity, and they don't explain that. Okay, because you're just like, you're 100% Irish. No, you're not 100% Irish. You have that admixture, but it's you're getting 100% Irish, but you're admixed because they just label that whole genetic pattern. Why am I like, okay? Genetic pattern as 100% Irish, which is true in some sense because Irish, you're saying when you're saying Irish, you're saying tribal culture Irish. So your originators, because you can have these sort of different, like someone with Mexican heritage, they have these distinct genetic facets, but all their recent originators were tribally, were culturally Mexican, right? So they were, in a sense, 100%. All your recent originators were culturally, um, sort of Celtic Irish or something like that. Yes, but are you literally 100% a continent? No. Are you 100% genetically a tribe? In a sense, because tribes are just membership based groups that intermarry. Okay, but no, you're admixed. You see this more with like Ashkenazi Jews. They're called European Jewish. Okay, where do Jews come from? The Middle East, the Levantine, whatever you want to call it, and they migrated to Europe, and then they admixed with different groups there, and that's how they are now. But they get 100% European Jewish, 100% Ashkenazi Jewish. How? They're basically half Levantine associated DNA, half Middle Eastern. Because we can say, let's call it Middle Eastern, like let's just do 6. MMM, that's that Middle Eastern associated DNA. EEE, that's that European associated DNA. Then they just label the whole entire genetic pattern because this is at a molecular level, right? You could almost see it like a rope. A rope is one thing, but half the strands are one color and half the strands are other colors. We can look at those different strands, but it's still one thing. They label the whole rope, the whole genetic pattern as European Jewish. So then if you have genetic patterns that they similar to what they label 100%, what they label European Jewish, they will give you that. Scan a chunk of your DNA, very similar to this DNA that we labeled European Jewish. Okay, give them 25%. Scan it again, 25%. Scan it again, 25%. Scan it again, 25%. 100% European Jewish. Even though they're half Middle Eastern in a sense, because none of this is literal. Mm-hmm. But they are from like a distinct genetic facet or pool, whatever you want to call it. And it's the same with like some like Somali associated populations. They're like half have half West Asian associated DNA, and they take it as proof. Like, see, we are 100% African. I mean, no, you're not, because none of it's literal. But WWW, AAA, West Asian, West Asian, West Asian, African, 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 label the whole pattern as African, as Somali, which is why you get 100% African, 100% Somali. Okay, so these companies are not explaining that to people. People are like, see, yeah, I'm 100% African. I'm this, I'm this, I'm that, I'm that. No, 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 no. Just off the top, none of it is literal. Okay, and then you have the people like in the U.S. like, I'm 100%, 80% British. No, you're not. If we wanted to say like that genetic patterns, because DNA is always changing, it's always evolving, and then there's like the bottleneck aspects and admix aspects. No, if we were to label it, it would be Yank. You're like 80% Yank or 80% Dixian and like 20% British. Okay. So these tests are, you know, but that doesn't mean that it can't be useful, that it can't be helpful, because it's true in a sense. Okay. It's it's telling you like if you get like 5% Japanese, right? That could tell you that your what's that like your like your great grandparent, one of your great grandparents were one of your great grandparents was Japanese. Yes, but if you say it in that sort of flat way, yes, it's saying that probably one of your great grandparents had genetic pattern had a genetic pattern of modern contemporary populations whose originators had a historical presence in Japan. Okay, and that doesn't, and it's what your originator was, because sometimes it doesn't even that doesn't mean what your originator was, because it's like the same thing. Like some people will get like I get like a little smidge of like Amerindian associated DNA. So that would indicate like some type of Amerindian ancestor, but they weren't. They were, I would say they were more culturally, they were Matisse. Because then we start sort of associating these places with, like, I get like a little bit of Irish. I don't consider it as Celtic, culturally Celtic Irish, because around the time they left Ireland, they were already, that's when sort of English was rising in that country. Like people will say that they're Irish, but they're talking about, like, you can't say just simply Irish in this flat, static way. Like, because they're saying Irish, but in that Celtic Irish sense. Okay. Because country doesn't always correlate with culture. Like, but they weren't, because they were culturally like, I don't know, I just call it British Islander, because that's what they were. They didn't speak Irish or Celtic Irish. They spoke English with, like, I guess an Irish accent. But then calling some people Irish is erasure, because I don't have shelter that I know of origins. Okay, like that Japanese could be someone who migrated from Brazil and they spoke Brazilian. Like it's not kind of off labeling it as, I mean, that's just the sort of entanglement of this, because it even correlates with just it's a poor approach, it's a poor framework of how we approach it, all this in the first place. Like there was something later, like doing a study on Irish populations. It's like, which Irish? Like in a sense, you know what they mean, but you shouldn't have to try to figure out exactly what they mean, because it's like, do you mean like, are you trying to say like the um the Indo-European deeply deep interrelated lineages, just genetically red? I just use color for these distinct human giant gene pools. Like they're saying genetically red people. Is that what you mean? Because like Idris Elba is British in a sense, but I don't think we should say people are British. Like you're a country, like, but he's a British citizen. He has British heritage in a sense, right? He speaks with a British accent, just like other British people that you would call a British person. I mean, some people resist that because of like casteism, but they'll call Hugh Jackman an Australian actor. So other populations that don't have a whose genes don't have a historical precedence in a place can become a place. Like, okay, but yeah, these tests are misleading. What language do you speak? Very specific language do you speak? That's your that's your culture. That's your tribal culture, or that's your culture. Because I don't consider myself tribal at all. I speak a cosmopolitan language. I speak I speak basically North American English. It's not really, basically like a regional accent. It's a national way of speaking, and it's a cosmopolitan language. So, but saying someone who speaks like Mayan, okay, that's your culture. And then what are your originators? What very specific language did they speak? Then that's your heritage, because sometimes that doesn't correlate. Because I do have my originators spoke. I have U.S. Creole origins, Atlantic Creole origins, so they spoke with a Creole accent and a Creole language, but I don't. Like you could have a different culture from your parents even, and your grandparents. If you're not expressing that culture, you're not that culture. So what very specific language did they speak? Like everything's just not so cookie cutter and clear cut, and like this sort of fragmented, clear cut, puzzle pieces or something. Because again, it's like, okay, sure, I get this like 2-3% Irish, but were they in that sense of like this sort of caricature Irish person, like that image that we conjure when we're saying an Irish person? It's like, mm, they were kind of speaking English, kind of maybe not at that point when they immigrated here. I think they immigrated here around like 1830 or something to Canada. Were they? I don't know. Um, but yeah, what's very specific language? Then that's your heritage. Mhm. So my origins are like Creole. I would say British Islander. But then I do also have some, technically in a sense, some, I guess, Celtic Irish origins, because if you go back further enough, then their parent, they probably didn't speak it, like my fourth great grandparents, but their fifth and sixth great grandparents there. And then some of those percentages do reflect that a smidge. So, like, Creole, British Islander, Celtic Irish, you know, lots of various Niger Congo populations. Um, Yeah, because the whole African thing is just a super mess. All the countries they list, they didn't exist. So I can't be 25% Nigerian because Nigeria didn't exist until 1950. Most of my originators came there from when it was like from like the 1830s to like the 1600s. Those countries didn't exist. That national culture, because then there's is a Nigerian culture, a national culture, which some people will claim like I am Nigerian. No, none of my originators were culturally Nigerian because Nigeria didn't exist. Yes, it was probably developing at some point, but even my originators weren't really a part of that either. They were Yoruba, they were Ibu, they were Fulani. That's it. Okay, so no, I can't claim it the national culture, and like that doesn't make sense. Okay, like they should have used languages instead of countries, but they just wanted to use, it's not just misleading. They want to use buzzwords and make it seem more appealing because they could tweak it a bit, but then people would get like 100% Icelandic. It's like that doesn't sell. Okay, and then another issue is people have this sort of they're freezing. Um, they're sort of it's like they're turning things into these frozen caricatures. Right? People have this sort of almost romanticized idea of Ireland, like it was frozen in time. Like so, I have some Yoruba origins, right? But I don't have current Yoruba origins. Like people will go there and be like reconnecting with Yoruba people, but that's not my culture either. That's not my origins either. Um, for like, look how in the U.S. how much culture has changed. Think about how people dressed in the 1980s through how people dressed in the 1820s. Like people will go to these African countries and be like, oh, they'll wear like Yoruba clothing, current European clothing. But our Yoruba originators were wearing something else because people are alive, living people, and the cultures are always moving. They spoke a different language. They wore different clothing. They had a different culture. Like um, 1810 Yoruba culture was a different culture than 2020 Yoruba culture. You know what I'm saying? Even look at dialects. They could have spoken a different language, right? We have old Southern U.S. English, which evolved into this sort of modern Southern U.S. English. Um, our originators spoke. They were expressing a different culture. So people try to reconnect with these cultures, but you're reconnecting a culture that was never your culture, like Irish or like any of them. Like even people will tell Italians, like they will go back to Italy and they're speaking like an older dialect, how they used to speak Italian, because the culture continues, but you're claiming modern, current Italian culture, but you were never even a part of it. Okay? So that's my take and experience on these companies. They can be useful, it can be valuable, and there's other little shady aspects um, of these companies, right? But that's I would just say approach with conscience, conscious approach with caution, and um, also in that view that's a bit more realistic.